His fiancée called me to the wedding to humiliate me, but the waitress just said one sentence and the room fell silent. Subscribe and subscribe in the comments from where you're watching this video. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the London flat, casting long golden rectangles across the oak floors. The air inside was still, touched by the quiet rustle of pages turning, a sound that echoed like soft footsteps in a library. Skye Williams sat at the kitchen table, her fingers resting lightly on a mug of jasmine tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelope lying untouched in front of her. It had arrived 2 days ago without warning, hand-delivered, addressed in embossed calligraphy so elegant it felt like mockery. She hadn't opened it immediately. Something about it made her pause. There were no stamps, no return address, only her name, her real name, the one few people used anymore. Skylar Renee Williams. Not Miss Williams, not to the attention of, just her name, written like a whisper from a past life she no longer lived. It was her son, Eli, who finally broke the spell. "Mama," he'd said, standing in the doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a curious tilt to his brow. "Why are you staring at the mail like it insulted you?" She gave a breath of a laugh but didn't answer. Even now, 2 days later, she wasn't sure she had one. The envelope remained in the same place, untouched. But today, something shifted. The weight of unspoken things demanded breath. She reached for it slowly, peeled back the seal, and withdrew the heavy cardstock with hands that had once scrubbed floors and carried groceries through the rain while balancing a sleeping child. Now, those same hands signed contracts, managed portfolios, and lifted other women out of their own storms. Still, they trembled. The text was printed in gold leaf, the kind favored by people with old money and a desperate need to prove it. The names glared back at her in florid cursive. Madeline Annabelle Huntington and Tyler James Brooks cordially invite you to their wedding celebration at the Huntington Estate, Georgia, USA, on Saturday, May 14th at 5 p.m. Skye read the lines 3 times, each word burning hotter than the last. Tyler. He hadn't crossed her mind in months. Years, maybe. The last time she'd seen him was 11 years ago, just days before Eli was born, when he walked out the door with a suitcase and silence, leaving behind an apartment filled with bills, unanswered questions, and the echo of dreams turned hollow. Madeline. Of course it would be her. The woman Tyler's mother had always insisted he should have married instead, blonde, born into wealth, with a smile as sharp as a blade. Back then, Madeline had laughed behind manicured hands and made jokes that weren't really jokes, asking Skye if she knew how to polish silver or if she planned to wear those shoes to church again. And now they were getting married, and had invited her. Skye let out a slow breath. No, not invited. Summoned. This wasn't an olive branch. This was a calculated gesture, like dangling meat in front of a lion in a cage, expecting her to flinch, to roar, to make a scene. But she didn't roar anymore. She'd learned the power of silence, of timing. The most dangerous thing about a storm was not its noise, but the moment before it broke. And Skye had become an expert in holding her silence until it could break mountains. That night, after dinner, she sat with Eli on the living room sofa, their legs stretched out side by side, watching a documentary about African architecture. She waited until the credits rolled, then turned and placed the invitation in his lap. He read it quietly, his brows drawn together. "Is this real?" he asked. "He's getting married?" Skye nodded once. "Yes." Eli was silent for a moment, then, "Why did they send it to you?" She shrugged. I don't know. Maybe they wanted me to see it. Maybe they thought I wouldn't come." He stared at the gold lettering the same way she had, but then he said something she hadn't expected. "You should go." Sky blinked. "Why on earth would I do that?" He didn't look up. "Because you're not who they remember, and they need to see that." She laughed, bitter at the edges. What good would that do? Let them parade around their estate, sipping champagne and pretending the past didn't happen? "No," he said, his voice steady. "So you don't forget. So they know they didn't break you." He handed the card back to her with the calm finality of someone twice his age. Sky held it loosely, the edges bending slightly under her fingers. She didn't answer him then. She didn't need to. The decision had already begun to grow roots. The next morning, she made one phone call to the only man she still considered family. Uncle Joe, her mother's brother, a retired mechanic who had helped raise her after her mom passed. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "Tell me the time and place. I'll be there." The flight arrangements were discreet. Sky wasn't the kind of woman who needed to fly commercial. Her success was hidden behind shell companies and subsidiaries, her name never appearing on the surface. But the power behind it? Undeniable. She owned buildings she'd never visited, brands that used her strategies but not her face, and a growing empire that had started on a borrowed laptop at a diner table. But none of that mattered at the moment. What mattered was the boy sleeping in the next room, a boy who'd never met his father, who had grown up with bedtime stories about astronauts and superheroes, but never once asked why his mom flinched when the phone rang after dark. She watched him sleep that night, his face peaceful, lashes thick against his cheeks. Her throat tightened. She had built a fortress around him, brick by brick, with every sacrifice she had made. And now they were daring to act like none of it had ever happened. Fine, she would go, but not to please them, and not for vengeance. She would go because she had been underestimated for too long. And the only thing more powerful than truth was a woman who had nothing left to prove. 3 days later, Sky stood before the mirror, dressed in a tailored navy blue dress that hugged her body like memory. Her curls were coiled into an elegant updo, her makeup soft but impeccable. Eli, standing beside her in a crisp blazer, stared at her reflection. "You look like someone important," he said. She smiled faintly. "I am." They flew to Georgia on a private jet under the name SW Holdings. No one on the guest list would recognize it. Not yet. As the plane descended, Sky looked out the window at the emerald fields and sprawling estates. This place had never felt like home. It still didn't. But this time she wasn't coming back as the outsider trying to belong. She was coming as the storm they never saw coming. And somewhere, beneath the sound of the engine, the whisper of destiny stirred. She would walk through their golden gates, not to reclaim something lost, but to remind them that what they threw away had become untouchable. What they tried to bury had bloomed, and they had just invited the roots into their garden. The air in Georgia was heavier than Sky remembered. It pressed against her skin with a damp warmth that clung to her clothes like old expectations. As the car pulled away from the private airstrip, winding through fields of magnolia and wrought iron fences, she could feel her chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the landscape of her undoing, the soil where her dreams had once been trampled under polished shoes and polite cruelty. Yet now she wasn't here to mourn the past. She was here to walk through it and leave footprints they couldn't erase. Eli sat quietly beside her in the back seat of the sleek black SUV, his eyes taken in the countryside as if searching for clues about a world he'd only heard of in fragments. The sun caught in his curls, and she watched the profile of his young face, so calm yet observant. He didn't ask questions, but she knew his mind was busy stitching stories out of things left unsaid. He didn't remember Tyler. There were no photos, no bedtime tales that included him. All he had was a name and the unspoken truth of abandonment. The kind of truth that didn't scream but echoed quietly in the hollow of one's chest. Skye leaned her head back against the seat, letting the rhythm of the road draw her into memory. The last time she'd been here, she was barely more than a girl herself, 23, wide-eyed, believing that love could conquer tradition, class, and generations of polite disdain. Tyler had whispered promises into her neck at midnight, had kissed the corners of her fear with assurance, but when the storm came, he had folded like paper. It wasn't even a dramatic exit. No fight, no slammed doors, just a note on the kitchen counter and a closet half empty. She had been 6 months pregnant. Her hands had shaken as she packed the rest of his clothes into boxes, not knowing where to send them. His family had stopped returning her calls. Friends she thought were mutual began declining her messages. And when the baby came, 2 weeks early, after a night of contractions that tore through her like grief, there was no one in the waiting room. Just her, a nurse with kind eyes, and a screaming miracle named Elijah. The first few years blurred together in shades of hunger and hard choices. She cleaned houses during the day, worked at a 24-hour diner at night. There were weeks she slept on the floor beside Eli's crib because she didn't trust the door lock. Months where dinner was just rice and hope. But in those same months, she taught herself to code, to design, to invest. The borrowed laptop from a church shelter became her window into a world where identity was optional and results were currency. It was a logo of all things that changed her life. A simple, elegant design for a local bakery run by a widow who paid her in cash and pies. The bakery's rebranding went viral after a travel blogger featured it. The woman gave Skye's number to a cousin who owned a restaurant. Then another cousin called, and another. In a matter of months, Skye was designing brands for startups in 3 states. She reinvested every dollar, saved receipts like prayers, and began learning the language of venture capital at night when Eli was asleep. By the time he was 6, they had moved into a modest apartment in Atlanta, safe, clean, with a tiny balcony where she grew basil and dreams. She never stopped working. She couldn't afford to, but with each contract, with every successful pitch and project, she built something no one could take from her: credibility. Not with her name. Never with her name. She chose anonymity with the same care one chooses armor. Skye created a parent company registered in Switzerland, filtered through shell holdings and blind trusts. On paper, she didn't exist. In reality, she sat at the helm of a discreet empire. She never put her face on anything, but her work spoke loudly in boardrooms she never entered in person. She had become the ghost in their machines, the architect of brands that whispered influence. But none of that had ever been for revenge. She didn't want Tyler to see her name in Forbes or stumble across her photo at a conference. She wanted peace, security, a world where Eli would never feel small or forgotten. She had sacrificed recognition for protection, and now, ironically, she was being dragged into the very spotlight she had spent years avoiding, by the same people who once cast her into the shadows. The car slowed as they approached the estate. The Huntington property stretched over 40 acres of manicured perfection. Skye had only been here twice before, once for a garden party that ended with a woman accidentally spilling wine on her dress, and once for a Christmas dinner where she was told, with a smile, that the kitchen staff had placed her coat with the deliveries. Now the gates opened without hesitation, as if they remembered her. She spotted the marquee tent first, a white behemoth framed by floral arches and glittering fairy lights. The house stood proudly behind it, all columns and legacy, draped in Confederate nostalgia and antique pride. There were valet attendants in tailored uniforms, guests arriving in designer gowns and tuxedos, and somewhere, music playing too softly to hear the melody. Eli looked at her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Yes." Her voice didn't shake. "I've never been more okay." Inside the main house, they were escorted to their guest suite, a room far from the bridal party, with a view of the stables and not the gardens, a subtle reminder of their place. But Skye didn't mind. She hadn't come to be seen. Not yet. That evening, while Eli rested, she stepped onto the balcony, the air humming with the energy of preparations. She could see caterers rushing in and out, florists adjusting last-minute arrangements. Everything had to be perfect. Of course it did. Madeline wouldn't have it any other way. Skye remembered the woman well, always impeccably dressed, her voice sweetly sharp, her eyes scanning rooms like a security system looking for intrusions. She had once told Skye, in the middle of a brunch, "I'm sure Tyler means well. He just likes to fix things." She had smiled then, sipping her mimosa. "You must be exhausting." Now, that same woman had orchestrated a wedding on ancestral grounds, invited the ex-wife like a party favor, and likely believed she'd be too ashamed to show up. Skye smiled into the twilight. Let her think so. Later that night, she opened her laptop. Emails waited. Documents needed review. She worked in silence while Eli slept, the soft glow of the screen illuminating her calm face. Every keystroke was a reminder of where she had been, of who she had become. She signed off with a final click, closed the lid, and sat back. Tomorrow she would enter their world again. But she was no longer the woman who had cried in borrowed maternity clothes or begged a landlord for one more week. She had walked through fire and come out diamond. They buried her once. They wouldn't be able to do it again. Morning came quietly. A soft mist had rolled in overnight, draping the Huntington estate in a veil of silver that clung to the boxwoods and rose trellises like a secret waiting to be whispered. Skye stood at the window of the guest suite, arms folded across her chest, watching the fog burn away under the rising sun. The early light filtered through the gauzy curtains and cast a faint shimmer across the polished floor. In a few hours, that peaceful garden would be filled with music, laughter, and lies stitched together with champagne and porcelain smiles. Behind her, Eli stirred in his bed, groaning softly as he woke. She turned and gave him a small smile, her hand reaching for the silk robe draped over the chair. He sat up slowly, his eyes still puffy with sleep, blinking at the room as if remembering where they were. She crossed the floor and sat beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead. "You ready for today?" she asked gently. He gave a lopsided shrug. "As ready as I'll ever be." Then after a pause, "You sure you want to go through with this?" Her fingers paused against his hair. She didn't answer right away, but her expression softened. "I'm not here for revenge," she said, "and I'm not here to prove anything. I'm just done hiding." Eli nodded slowly. He didn't press her. He never did. It was one of the things she loved most about him. His quiet intuition. He saw things most boys his age didn't. Processed emotion with a maturity that often startled her. And today, They would walk together into the belly of a world that had once cast them aside, carrying truths no one expected. By mid-morning, the estate had come alive. Golf carts zipped along gravel paths, florists trimmed the last hydrangeas, and staff in matching uniforms moved like a rehearsed ballet. Skye dressed deliberately, selecting a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure modestly but powerfully. The color glowed against her skin, and when she applied her lipstick, just a touch bolder than usual, she didn't flinch at her reflection. She looked like a woman in control, not a guest invited to be pitied. Eli emerged from the bathroom in his tailored navy suit, looking several inches taller than usual. His tie was slightly crooked, and she stepped forward to fix it, smoothing it down with a gentle tug. "Perfect," she said. "I feel like a character in a movie," he muttered. She smiled. "That's because you're about to be in a scene no one will forget." They walked down to the main house together, escorted by a young staffer who seemed barely older than Eli. He kept glancing at Skye with a look she knew too well, curiosity laced with uncertainty. That subtle shift people made when they couldn't quite place you in the social hierarchy and were too polite, or too afraid, to ask. The reception area had been transformed. Golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling like upside-down sunburst, casting warm light across cream linens and gold-trimmed china. White orchids lined every table, and crystal flutes stood at each setting like miniature glass soldiers. The whole room shimmered, curated to perfection and utterly devoid of sincerity. Guests arrived in clusters, all handshakes and air kisses. The men wore tuxedos with family crests embroidered on their cuffs. The women dripped in diamonds and lineage. Skye and Eli slipped into the edges of the gathering, taking their designated seats near the back as expected. Not family, not even friends. Just relics of a past politely acknowledged and publicly dismissed. She didn't mind. From her seat, Skye had a full view of the main aisle. At the far end stood a marble altar flanked by pillars wrapped in tulle and roses. A string quartet rehearsed softly in the corner, their bows slicing through the notes of Vivaldi like practiced precision. Every inch of the scene screamed curated elegance. She spotted Tyler before he saw her. He stood near the altar, speaking with one of the groomsmen, a drink already in hand. His tuxedo fit like armor, pressed and perfect, his hair slicked back in the style he used to swear he hated. The years had done little to change him. He still had that boyish jawline, the practiced charm, the easy stance that masked deeper discomfort. When he finally turned and looked toward the guest, their eyes met for a fleeting second. His smile faltered. Skye didn't blink. He looked away. The music swelled, signaling the approach of the bride. People rose in unison, and Madeline made her entrance like a scene from a fashion spread. Her dress was an elaborate confection of lace and satin, the veil trailing like a bridal train from a fantasy. Her hair, a golden halo of soft waves, shimmered under the light. Every step she took seemed calculated, each smile curated. She wasn't walking toward Tyler, she was walking toward the audience. Skye watched with clinical detachment. There was no trace of nerves in Madeline's expression, no emotion except performance. This wasn't about love. It was about display, about conquest. And somewhere beneath that glossy surface, Skye recognized something cold and vicious, something that hadn't changed since their first encounter. She glanced at Eli. He stared straight ahead, his hands clenched in his lap, jaw set. The ceremony passed like a blur of empty words and forced sentiment. Vows were exchanged with the fervor of scripted roles. The kiss that followed drew polite applause, not because it moved anyone, but because it was expected. As guests flowed into the reception tent, the champagne began to pour. Laughter rose, small talk rippled like surface tension. Skye remained seated, observing. Madeline floated through the crowd like a queen anointed by blood and money, greeting guests with kisses and compliments. And then she noticed Skye. For a moment, their eyes locked. Madeline's smile stretched, slow and deliberate, as she made her way over. Skye stood before she could be approached sitting. It was instinct, not submission. She would never give Madeline the chance to loom over her. "Well," Madeline said with mock surprise, voice honeyed with just the right edge of venom. "You came? I wasn't sure if you'd get the invitation in time. International mail can be so unreliable." Skye smiled, cool and steady. "It found me." Madeline's eyes flicked to Eli, who now stood just behind his mother's shoulder. "And you brought a +1. How charming." Skye didn't flinch. "This is my son, Elijah." Madeline's gaze lingered on him for a beat too long before returning to Skye. "Of course. I suppose we all carry pieces of the past with us, don't we?" Skye tilted her head slightly, the way one might when examining a painting too garish to be real. "Some of us carry them, others pretend they never existed." Madeline's smile tightened. "Well, I do hope you enjoy the evening. We have quite the program planned." Skye didn't answer. She didn't need to. Madeline was already walking away, her train trailing behind her like a tattered promise. The evening wore on in a blur of clinking glasses and curated perfection. Skye remained on the periphery, never entirely part of the crowd, never fully removed. She watched Eli navigate the room with quiet poise, noted how he returned the curious stares with calm defiance. And then, just before the toasts, she saw her. A young woman in a crisp server's uniform, moving between tables with practiced ease. Dark skin, tightly coiled hair pinned back under a cap, eyes scanning the room with quiet alertness. For a moment, Skye thought their eyes had met. Something in the girl's gaze flickered. Recognition, maybe. Then she looked away and disappeared behind the catering curtain. Skye's pulse quickened, though she didn't know why. When the toasts began, they followed the predictable path: laughter, nostalgia, shallow praise. Skye tuned most of it out until Madeline stood at the head table, raising her glass with the confidence of someone born to be listened to. "I just want to say," Madeline began, "how grateful I am for today, for love, for second chances. When I met Tyler, he was recovering, I suppose, from a dark place, a complicated chapter. We don't always talk about the people who came before, but some chapters, well," she laughed lightly, "they end for a reason." There were scattered chuckles from the guests. Madeline continued. "He was lost, broken even, but I saved him. I gave him a new beginning, a better one." More laughter, toasts raised, clinks of crystal. Skye didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. But she felt Eli's fingers curl tightly around hers. Something in the air shifted, a current of tension, quiet but unmistakable, and somewhere beyond the edge of the crowd, the young server stepped out from behind the curtain. She was walking toward the front, and in that moment, the night began to change. The moment Anais stepped into the aisle, time seemed to shift. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp, no swell of music, no glass shattering on the marble floor. Instead, the air took on a new weight, a quiet density that settled over the crowd like the hush before a storm. She moved with slow purpose, her serving tray still held in one hand as if she'd forgotten to put it down. Her black shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, the hem of her catering uniform brushing her knees. People barely noticed her at first, their attention still fixed on Madeline, who stood frozen with her champagne flute raised, eyes narrowed in confusion. Skye saw it immediately. The change in Aeneas's posture, the flicker of something not quite anger, but something just as powerful. Purpose. It burned in the girl's eyes. Skye's own breath caught in her throat, though her face remained still. She felt Eli tense beside her, his grip tightening ever so slightly. Aeneas stopped just a few feet from the head table. She looked first at Madeline, then at the guests, her throat working as she swallowed. And then, in a voice that was surprisingly steady and loud enough to carry across the room, she said, "Excuse me, I have something to say." The chatter ceased instantly. Forks paused midair, laughter died on lips. A ripple of surprise moved through the room like a wave. Skye could almost feel the intake of breath around her, hundreds of lungs preparing to inhale and hold. Aeneas stood taller now, her hands trembling only slightly. Madeline blinked. "I'm sorry, but this isn't—" "I won't be long," Aeneas said, cutting her off without apology. Her eyes never left the bride. "I just wanted to tell you all who she is," she said, turning slightly so more of the room could see her. "That woman in the back." She raised a hand, pointing directly toward Skye. "Her name is Skye Williams. You probably know her as the ex-wife, the one who got left behind, but that's not who she is. Not anymore. Not really." Now the silence turned into murmurs. Heads craned. All eyes shifted to Skye, who sat still as stone, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She didn't look away. Aeneas pressed forward, voice gaining force. "I met Skye 2 years ago. I was homeless, 19, living out of a shelter after my scholarship fell through and my parents cut me off. I was ready to give up. I was standing outside a job center in the rain when a woman came up to me. She didn't ask what I'd done or how I'd ended up there. She just handed me a business card and said, 'You're not done yet.' That woman was Skye." Now the guests were listening, really listening. "She gave me a job, a place to stay, paid for therapy, helped me get back into school. And not just me. There are dozens of us, women who were cast aside, ignored, hurt, forgotten. She built something for us, a foundation, a network. She built a home for people who had none. While you were laughing at her, while you were calling her broken, she was rebuilding lives, including her own." Aeneas's voice cracked, but she kept going. "And in case any of you care about status, yes, she's successful, very successful. The investment firm that just acquired 20% of the Huntington Group, that was her, Skye Williams. She did that, silently, privately. She never wanted attention, but tonight, you made her the punchline of your celebration, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The effect was immediate. Madeline's face had drained of color, her lips parted slightly in disbelief. Tyler looked like he'd been struck, the whiskey glass in his hand trembling. A man near the front lowered his phone, which had been recording. Aeneas turned to the head table once more. "You said you saved him," she said, her voice sharp now, "but you didn't save anyone. You walked into a life already wrecked and pretended the debris wasn't yours to deal with. You called her broken when she was the one holding the pieces together. You mocked her pain because it made you feel powerful. But real power doesn't need an audience." With that, she stepped back, placed the tray carefully on a nearby table, and removed her server's cap. Her hands shook slightly as she walked back into the crowd, but her shoulders were squared, her spine straight. She had done what needed to be done. The silence remained, stretching long and taut. Then someone clapped. It started in the back, hesitant. Another joined. Then a third. Within seconds, the sound grew into something impossible to ignore. A scattered, uneven applause that built not from social pressure, but from something truer, from respect. Skye rose slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't wave or nod. She simply walked, her heels clicking against the marble with quiet certainty. Eli rose beside her, and together they stepped toward the center of the room. Madeline looked stunned. Her hand still gripped her champagne flute like a lifeline, but her knuckles were white. Skye stopped a few paces from the head table. For the first time that evening, she addressed the room. "I didn't come here for any of this," she said, her voice clear and low. "I came because I was invited. I thought maybe it was a gesture of peace, or closure. I was wrong." She looked at Madeline, then at Tyler. "But I'm not angry, I'm not humiliated, I'm not broken." Her eyes moved across the sea of faces. "What I am is awake. I survived, I rebuilt, I raised a son who knows kindness is strength, and I will not allow anyone, ever again, to tell my story for me." She turned then, ready to leave, but Madeline finally found her voice. "You can't just hijack my wedding like this," she snapped. "You can't ruin everything because you're bitter." Skye stopped, slowly turned. "If your wedding can be ruined by the truth," she said calmly, "maybe it wasn't built on anything real to begin with." There was a collective exhale, as if the whole room had been holding its breath. Skye didn't stay to hear what came next. She took Eli's hand, nodded once to Aeneas in silent thanks, and began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted without a word. Behind her, the world she had once tried so hard to belong to crumbled under its own weight, its carefully painted walls revealing the cracks beneath. And she didn't look back. The air outside was cooler than it had been all day, touched by the whisper of an approaching storm. The sky above the Huntington estate had turned a deep, bruised violet, and a thin breeze rustled the tall hedges along the gravel drive. Skye didn't speak as she walked, Eli's hand in hers, their footsteps falling in rhythm. Her pulse still beat heavily beneath her skin, but her face was composed. Behind them, the ballroom was silent. No music, no laughter, no applause. The performance had ended, and reality had spilled onto the polished floor like wine that would never come out of the silk. They made it halfway across the garden path when a sharp voice broke the stillness behind them. "Wait!" It was Madeline. Skye didn't stop, not right away. But Eli turned, and she followed his gaze as Madeline stormed toward them, the hem of her designer gown gathering dirt, curls bouncing in practiced waves, though her face had lost its lacquered shine. Her mouth was tight, her eyes wild, not the poised bride of an hour ago, but a woman unraveling thread by thread, pulled apart by a truth she hadn't expected to face. "You can't just do that," Madeline spat, her voice shrill with panic. "You don't get to hijack my wedding and humiliate us like that." Skye stopped. She didn't move toward her, but she didn't flinch either. Eli took a step back, standing slightly behind his mother, watching. "Us?" Skye said evenly. "There was no hoose in that room, just a lie and an audience." Madeline's jaw tightened. "You're bitter. That's all this is. You've held on for too long, and now you're trying to destroy what he and I have. Pathetic." "No," Skye said, her voice still calm. "What's pathetic is building your fairy tale on someone else's grave." "You think anyone cares about your sob story?" Madeline sneered. "You were nothing. He left you. He moved on. That's how life works. Maybe if you were stronger, you could have kept him." Eli made a sharp sound, something between a breath and a protest, but Skye raised a hand slightly to stop him. Her eyes were fixed on Madeline. I was strong enough to survive without him, Sky said. To raise a child, build a life, and never once need your permission to keep breathing. From the shadows near the columns of the veranda, another figure appeared. Tyler. He looked different now. His tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled. His eyes were haunted, not by fear or embarrassment, but by something deeper. Recognition. A man forced to look at the ruins he had left behind and see the people still standing inside them. "Sky," he said, his voice hoarse but not angry, almost reverent. "I never meant for this to happen." She turned to him slowly. "Which part? Leaving me while I was pregnant, or pretending your son didn't exist?" He flinched. That was what it looked like. A small, involuntary wince that made something in his carefully arranged expression shatter. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, but it sounded more like a question than an explanation. "No," she said quietly. "You were protecting yourself." He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. And then Eli stepped forward. His voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. "Do you even know what day I was born?" Tyler's head snapped toward him, his mouth opened again, searching, failing. Silence was louder than any answer he could have given. "I used to tell myself you were dead," Eli said, his eyes burning, "because that was easier than believing you were alive and just didn't care." Sky felt her chest crack open, not with pain, but with something older, like an echo of a scream she'd buried long ago. "I sent you letters," Eli continued. "I asked about you. I asked Mom if you would ever come back. And when I stopped asking, it wasn't because I forgot. It was because I gave up." Tyler looked at the ground now, shoulders heavy, lips parted but mute. Madeline had gone quiet too. She looked at Eli like he was a stranger who had appeared out of thin air and shattered the chandelier above her head. "I forgive you," Eli said. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just plainly. The words dropped into the air like stones into water. "Not for you, for me. Because carrying your absence has been exhausting. And I'm done." Tyler lifted his head. His eyes were glassy now. "You're incredible," he whispered. "You both are." Sky's expression didn't soften. "We didn't need you to see that to make it true." Then Eli turned toward his mother. "She made me that way." He pointed to her, and in that gesture, Sky felt something inside her realign, like the foundation of her life was finally solid beneath her feet. There was no applause, no orchestral swell, but it was the loudest moment she had ever lived through. A son choosing his mother. A truth that couldn't be undone. Madeline's arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face had lost all color, and the edge in her voice was brittle. "So, what now?" she asked. "You just walk away and act like none of this matters?" Sky tilted her head slightly. "No. We walk away because none of this matters." "If you wanted a perfect story," Eli added, "you should have picked someone who had nothing to hide." Madeline stared at them, something like panic flaring in her eyes again. She looked at Tyler as if begging him to say something. He said nothing. Without another word, Sky turned. Eli walked beside her. This time, no one called after them. No one tried to stop them. No one dared. The clouds had deepened above them, and a faint drizzle began to fall, cool and soft, tapping against the marble path as they returned to the guest house. Uncle Joe waited by the car, leaning against the hood like he'd been expecting the exact moment they'd emerge. He looked at their faces, at the dampness in the air, at the silence around them, and nodded once. "Guess that's what they call a mic drop," he said. Eli laughed, and this time so did Sky. Not the careful, polite laugh of survival, but a real one. the kind that loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized she was still holding. A laugh that tasted like freedom. The next morning, the wedding footage was already making its way across the internet. Not through tabloids or press releases, but through grainy cell phone clips, anonymous TikToks with titles like Waitress, shuts down bride's insult with epic speech, and the truth at the wedding no one saw coming. Skye didn't watch them. She didn't need to. She had lived it, and she wasn't interested in reliving a story that no longer belonged to her. Messages came flooding in. Friends she hadn't heard from in years, colleagues, women she'd once mentored. Some apologized for the distance they created when her life had fallen apart. Others simply said, "You were so brave." But bravery wasn't what she felt. She felt clear, unburdened. She felt like someone who had finally stopped trying to disappear. There was no phone call from Tyler, no apology letter, no email, and Skye didn't expect one. The silence that followed was its own confession. It said more than words ever could. Madeline's name appeared in gossip columns for a week. A few influential bloggers picked up the story. Someone from the venue leaked that she had left the reception early and skipped the honeymoon entirely. Rumors swirled that she'd moved out. Whether the marriage survived or not, Skye didn't care. Because this story had never really been about them. It was about her. About the girl who had been discarded and told she wasn't enough. About the woman who had survived, not by becoming someone else, but by finally becoming herself. It was about a son who saw through absence and chose to love anyway, and about the power of truth, not spoken in anger, but in clarity. In the days that followed, the house felt different. Lighter. Not because it was filled with noise or guests, but because the shadows had shifted. Eli walked taller. He asked sharper questions. He no longer mumbled when someone asked who his father was. And Skye, she started something new. She opened her laptop and began to write. First, just for herself. Fragments, essays, moments. Then she sent one to a parenting blog. It was published. The comments poured in. Women from all over the world responded with their own stories. Grief, abandonment, strength. They said, "Thank you." That turned into a blog. Then a community. And then a nonprofit. The second thread. A space for women healing from abandonment, divorce, emotional abuse. They hosted circles, offered counseling, taught women how to write their own stories, literally and figuratively. Skye didn't build it to be a legacy. She built it to be a lifeline, a new thread for those who'd been unraveled. And the most powerful moment of all didn't happen at a podium or in a blog post. It happened one night in their kitchen in January. She was washing dishes. Eli was flipping through his notebook at the counter. "You know," he said casually, "I used to wish my real mom had stayed." Skye paused, the water still running over her fingers. "But now I get it," he said. "Maybe she left so I'd end up with you." Skye turned off the tap, dried her hands, and crossed the room. She pulled him into a hug, and he didn't resist. They stood like that for a long time, mother and son, born not just of blood, but of choice, of resilience, of love. Sometimes life tears out pages mid-chapter. But sometimes if you stay, if you fight, if you love, truly love, you get to write a better ending. And the best part is, you don't need anyone's permission to begin. The rain came heavier the next morning, tapping against the kitchen windows in a steady rhythm that felt both soothing and absolute. The Huntington estate was still, its manicured perfection shrouded in dampness and silence. Somewhere inside, staff moved about collecting floral arrangements and leftover place cards. But the electricity of the previous night still lingered in the air like the faint scent of ozone after lightning strikes. Skye stood at the window of the guest house kitchen, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching droplets race down the glass in long, winding paths. Her reflection was faint in the window, a composed silhouette wrapped in a robe, hair pinned loosely, face bare. She felt different, not in some dramatic, transformed sense, but in the way old burdens quietly shift off the shoulders, leaving a quiet ache where weight used to be. She had walked into that wedding as the woman they thought they remembered. She had walked out as the one they had tried, and failed, to erase. Eli padded into the room in his socks, still wearing the t-shirt he'd slept in. His curls were messy, and he rubbed one eye as he slid into the stool at the counter. "You sleep okay?" she asked without turning. "Yeah," he said around a yawn. "I dreamed we were at a museum, and there was a painting of you. It had a little plaque that said, 'The woman who walked through fire.'" She let out a soft laugh, turning toward him. "And what were you doing?" "I was telling people not to touch it," he said. "And this old guy kept trying to take a selfie with you. I had to stop him." Skye smiled and walked over, brushing her fingers over his head. "Thank you for that." He looked at her. "Are we going back today?" "Soon," she said. "But first, there's one more thing I need to do." He blinked at her, curious but not surprised. He had come to understand, especially in the last 24 hours, that his mother was the kind of person who tied things off at the root, who didn't leave threads dangling no matter how painful they were to grasp. They had breakfast in the quiet. No news played, no phones buzzed. The world felt paused, as if it, too, was waiting to see what she would do next. When they dressed and packed their bags, she made sure everything was neat and folded, her usual meticulousness soothing in its familiarity. Then she made a call. It was a direct line, one not easily found, one routed through a secure channel. When the woman answered, her voice was clipped and cautious. "This is Lark Huntington." "This is Skye Williams," she replied calmly. "We need to talk." There was a pause. "Where?" "Your office, in 30 minutes. The line clicked off. No confirmation, no hesitation. Skye dressed deliberately, not in the emerald dress from the wedding, nor in business armor. Instead, she chose tailored slacks and a soft cream blouse, her hair coiled into a low knot, earrings simple gold studs. She wore no perfume. She didn't need to be seen as a threat. She only needed to be heard. Lark Huntington's office was in the oldest wing of the estate, tucked behind a paneled corridor where family portraits lined the walls like reminders of a lineage too proud to apologize. Skye walked past oil paintings of men in military dress and women in lace collars, past gilded sconces and polished wood. The hallway smelled of furniture polish and old secrets. When she entered the office, Lark was already seated behind a large mahogany desk, a fountain pen in hand, papers neatly arranged before her. She didn't rise, but her eyes lifted, cool and assessing. Her gray hair was swept into an elegant twist, her suit a deep navy, every inch of her posture rigid with inherited authority. "I was wondering if you'd show up," she said. "You were expecting me?" Skye asked, sitting without invitation. "I expected something. You've never been predictable." Skye folded her hands. "I won't take much of your time." "Good," Lark said. "I find the public dramatics of last night more than sufficient." "Do you?" Skye asked, tilting her head slightly. "I found them lacking. See, the problem with hosting a charade in your own ballroom is that eventually someone will notice the foundation's rotting." Lark's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Sky continued. Your family's empire is propped up by illusion, controlled appearances, contracts hidden behind shell companies, charitable fronts with just enough compliance to avoid scrutiny. But it's a house of cards, and I now own part of it. That was a clever acquisition, Lark said slowly. I admit I didn't see it coming. You've kept yourself well hidden. That was the point. What are you after? Lark asked. If this is about revenge, you'll find I don't rattle easily. I'm not here for revenge, Sky said plainly. I'm here to correct the record. Lark's gaze sharpened. The record? You allowed your son to walk away from his responsibilities. You supported his disappearance. You called me unstable. You made it easy for him to vanish because I didn't fit your narrative. You were emotional, fragile. We were trying to protect Tyler. You protected a coward, Sky replied, and in doing so, tried to bury a mother and her child under your shame. For the first time, something flickered across Lark's face. Not guilt, not regret, just the faint twitch of discomfort, as if something had cracked in the carefully applied shell. I want every file, Sky said, every contract related to the Huntington Trust's dealings in my name, in my son's name, in any holdings you tried to erase. I want them released, corrected, audited, and I want it done within the week. You're threatening the family. No, Sky said softly. I'm offering you a chance to avoid exposure. You wouldn't dare. Sky leaned forward slightly. You've met me. You know I would. Lark didn't answer. She sat still, staring at the woman across from her who had once entered this house in borrowed heels and now returned as the storm itself. After a long pause, she said, You've changed. No, Sky said, I became visible. She stood. I won't come here again. But understand this. If you ever try to erase my name from this legacy again, you'll find it engraved in more places than you can destroy. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the old wood, leaving the scent of something final in the air. Outside, the drizzle had stopped. Eli waited by the car, reading from a book he held in one hand, his legs stretched out on the grass. When he saw her approach, he stood, smiling softly. How did it go? It's done, she said. They got into the car. Uncle Joe nodded from the driver's seat, put the vehicle in gear, and drove them away from the estate for the last time. The further they got, the lighter Sky felt. She rested her head against the window, watching the trees blur past. There would be headlines, there would be whispers, but none of it mattered now. The truth had been said, the lies had been pierced, and the boy beside her, her son, her reason, had seen everything and chosen her. That was all she needed. Back in London, the work resumed. The second thread grew. New stories emerged, women from all over the world finding strength in one another in their shared resilience. Sky traveled more, spoke at closed circles, helped shape legislation for single mothers' rights, all without fanfare. Eli started a podcast. It was quiet, thoughtful, built for kids his age who grew up wondering why their fathers never came back. He spoke with other teens, with therapists, with teachers. He never said Tyler's name. He didn't need to. And Sky, she wrote the things she'd been afraid to say out loud for years. The first manuscript wasn't polished, it wasn't poetic, but it was true. It was hers. When she sent it to a small publisher, she didn't expect much. 2 months later, they offered her a deal. The cover was simple, a single gold thread unraveling into light. The title, What They Tried to Bury. And beneath it, her name, bold, unhidden, unbroken, Sky Williams. The book arrived on a Tuesday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a single piece of white string. There was no fanfare, no bouquet of congratulatory flowers or bottle of champagne, only the quiet weight of something long overdue. Skye stood in the hallway of her London flat, the package in her hands heavier than its contents could possibly account for. She ran her fingers over the paper for a long moment before carefully tugging the knot loose. The cover was just as she'd envisioned it. A clean white field, the title printed in simple serif font, understated but firm. At the center, a thin gold thread spilled from the top margin and unraveled into delicate lines of light. The title sat beneath it like a promise etched in stone, what they tried to bury. Below that, in bold, her name. Not a pen name, not a pseudonym. Her name, Skye Williams. She turned it over in her hands slowly, opened the first page, and traced her fingertips across the dedication, "For Elijah, who taught me the difference between being broken and being whole." She closed the book gently, held it against her chest, and let out a long breath. It didn't feel like triumph, not in the cinematic sense. It felt like exhale, like the end of a song that had been caught in her throat for too many years. She had written her story, not the story they had told about her, not the fragmented whispers that had trailed her name like smoke, but the real one. And she had written it for the world to see. She placed the book on the coffee table and moved into the kitchen, where Eli sat at the counter with his laptop open and a bowl of cereal half-eaten beside him. He looked up when she entered, his brows lifting in question. "It came?" he asked. She nodded and smiled. He got up, rounded the island, and hugged her tightly. She felt the strength in his arms, the quiet certainty that had taken root in him this past year. He was taller now, both in height and in presence. He had grown in the way that children do when they're finally allowed to be more than their pain. "Did you read the dedication?" she asked. "I did," he said, "twice." She stepped back and looked at him, her smile warming. "Do you think it will matter? The book?" He nodded. "It already does." In the months following their return from Georgia, the world had shifted in quiet, irreversible ways. The Huntington name had been rattled, not destroyed. Too many layers protected legacies like theirs, but changed. The illusion of their perfection had cracked, and though they scrambled to patch it, something had been lost forever. The public might forget, but the people who mattered didn't. Madeline faded from social circuits, not immediately, not dramatically, but her appearances grew less frequent, her smile more forced. There were rumors of investors pulling back, of publicists urging her to lay low. No formal divorce ever made the press, but Tyler was seen alone more often than not. If they stayed together, they did so in silence. But that was no longer Skye's story. Her focus remained on the living, on the future. The second thread expanded rapidly. What began as a community group bloomed into a network spanning 5 countries. Sports circles were launched in New York, Johannesburg, Toronto, Berlin. Each city hosted gatherings for women who needed space to speak, to breathe, to remember that they weren't alone. There were writing workshops, legal aid partnerships, childcare programs for single mothers. Skye traveled often, not as a celebrity or motivational speaker, but as a witness. She sat with women in folding chairs and listened. She never opened with her own story. She didn't have to. They had read it. In the book, on the blog, in the unspoken ways trauma binds people before words ever do. One evening, she flew to Nairobi to attend a private summit hosted by a coalition of African feminist investors. The keynote speaker introduced her simply as a woman who didn't disappear. She stood before a room of 300 and told them not what happened to her, but what she did after, how she survived, how she rebuilt, how her son taught her to forgive. When she stepped off stage, a woman in the front row stood and began to clap, then another, then the entire room. She did not cry. She did not bow. She stood quietly, accepting the moment not as validation, but as communion. Back in London, Eli's podcast took off. What began as a recording project in his bedroom transformed into a digital platform with thousands of subscribers. Fatherless, not fearless, he called it. Each episode featured stories from teens who had been left behind, some by death, others by indifference. They talked about shame, about loneliness, about what it meant to be both angry and still hopeful. Eli never pretended to be a therapist. He just listened, and people listened back. One night, after a particularly emotional episode, he asked Skye if she'd be willing to come on as a guest. She hesitated. It was one thing to write. Speaking it aloud felt more dangerous, more permanent. But he looked at her with that same gentle patience he'd had since he was small, and she agreed. They recorded it at the kitchen table. No script, no questions, just conversation. He asked, "Do you remember the moment you realized you didn't need to forgive him to be free?" She thought for a long time before answering. "I think I always knew," she said, "but I wasn't ready to let go of what I thought I was owed." "What was that?" She looked at him, an apology, an explanation, closure. "Did you get it?" She smiled softly. "No, but I got you, and that was enough." It was their most downloaded episode to date. She received hundreds of messages afterward, some from strangers, some from former clients, even one from an old college roommate who'd ghosted her after the breakup, who wrote a long, stumbling apology that ended with, "I didn't know how to be your friend when you were in pain. I'm sorry." She responded only once. "Thank you, I understand. I hope you're well." Closure, it turned out, wasn't always about getting answers. Sometimes it was about choosing not to chase them anymore. The flat grew warmer as spring stretched toward summer. The days lengthened. The windows stayed open later into the evenings. Eli spent more time outside, biking along the river, meeting friends, preparing for his final year of school. He spoke with a confidence she hadn't seen before, the kind that came from healing, not from forgetting. One night in June they had dinner on the balcony. Simple pasta and wine for her, lemonade for him. They watched the city breathe beneath them, lights flickering on like stars reclaiming the sky. He said, "Do you ever think about going back?" She looked at him. "To Georgia?" He nodded. She sipped her wine. "Not really. It's not where my story lives anymore." He leaned back in his chair, the silence between them comfortable. "I'm glad we went, though." "Me too." A pause. "I think part of me needed to see it," he said. "Not just him, the whole place. I needed to know it wasn't better than us." She looked at him with something close to awe. "You're wiser than I'll ever be." He grinned. "I had a good teacher." When the night deepened and the dishes had been cleared, Skye returned to her writing desk. She had started her second book, this one not about her, but about the women she had met, their stories, their resilience, their rise. She wrote slowly, with care, wanting every word to carry the weight it deserved. She knew now that the world didn't need her perfection. It needed her truth, her flaws, her fire. And most of all, it needed her visibility. One afternoon in August, she received a message from Anais. It was short, a photo. In it, Anais stood in front of a small building with a painted sign that read The Thread House. Beneath it, a space for girls like me. She held a set of keys in one hand and her phone in the other. Her smile was radiant. In the caption, she wrote, "I opened it today because you didn't stop. Thank you." Sky stared at the screen for a long moment, her throat tight. She typed back, "You opened it. I just reminded you it was yours to begin with." The phone buzzed again. "Will you come to the opening event?" Sky smiled. "Of course I will." And when she did, when she stood beside Anais, surrounded by girls with eyes full of fire and fearlessness, she knew without doubt that the story she had written wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been called unworthy, to every girl who had been left behind, to every voice that had once whispered, "I can't," and now shouted, "Watch me." If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and check out our other videos for more powerful true stories. Thanks for watching.